Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we are diving into a literal investigative autopsy of a massive real estate construction fraud that was, unbelievably, hiding right in plain sight. We're going to look at a case involving a high-rise residential tower where the documents told a story of absolute perfection, while the physical reality, well, it was a structural disaster waiting to happen. For those of us focused on risk, compliance, and engineering, this is absolutely a masterclass in why you can never, ever entirely trust the paperwork. Our audit charter for today breaks down like this. First, the paper trail illusion. Second, uncovering the TMT fraud. Third, systemic root causes. And finally, process engineering the solution. Okay, let's dive into this first section. The paper trail illusion. This is what happens when perfect documentation completely masks physical failure. To really grasp how a fraud like this goes undetected, we first have to understand what we call the documentation trap. It's basically this deeply flawed methodology where an auditor just assumes that because a document has a nice, official-looking administrative signature on it, the actual physical work was performed correctly. In our case study of this high-rise tower, a routine compliance auditor was looking over the contractor's billing file. They saw the joint measurement sheet was duly signed by the site engineer. They tallied those quantities up with the goods receipt notes. Everything matched perfectly on paper, so they simply marked the controls as effective. They fell right into the trap, right? Just blindly believing the paperwork without ever verifying the physical reality. But here's where the story takes a turn. You can clearly see the contrast here between a standard box-checking audit and a truly vigilant one. While the standard auditor was busy just ticking boxes on measurement sheets, a sector-specialized risk auditor stepped in and noticed something really strange. It was a behavioral anomaly. The handwriting, the ink flow, the formatting of the joint measurement sheet, it all strongly indicated it was prepared and signed in a single sitting, supposedly covering multiple days of work. And this vigilant auditor didn't just stop there. They cross-referenced this paperwork with the physical site entry logs and found out the site engineer wasn't even on the site during the dates those measurements were supposedly recorded. That discovery triggered an immediate escalation. The auditor knew they had to bypass the desk entirely and head straight up to the 14th floor. Let's move to Section 2. Uncovering the TMT fraud by bypassing that paperwork for a live physical inspection. Now, what's really interesting about this is what happened when they arrived on the 14th floor, where active reinforcement binding was actually underway. The sheer scale of the physical deviations was staggering, all perfectly masked by that flawless documentation. First off, severe spacing violations. The center-to-center distance between the TMT bars was uniformly 20 millimeters wider than the structural design specified. And why do they do this? Well, deliberately widening that gap reduces the total volume of steel you use per square foot, which directly inflates the contractor's profit margins, all while severely compromising the slab's load-bearing capacity. Second, massive material degradation. The steel being bound was heavily rusted and pitted, meaning improper storage, or honestly, they probably bought rejected scrap. And finally, brand substitution. The physical bars didn't even conform to the approved Tier 1 brands mandated in the purchase order. So when confronted with this catastrophic physical reality, you know what the site engineer tried to do? They completely dismissed it. They literally called it a one-off error isolated to the 14th floor. But come on, this was a fraudulent denial. The exact match between the falsified measurements and the substituted material on site proved this was absolutely not a mistake. It was a highly systemic, calculated material substitution that they were desperately trying to pass off as just a temporary oversight. Which brings us to Section 3, Systemic Root Causes and Diagnosing the Breakdown of the Control Environment. If we map these root causes, it reveals a complete systemic breakdown. We really need to shift our focus from just the physical symptoms up on the 14th floor to the cultural failure of the entire site's control environment. The site was suffering from a heavily desk-based engineering culture, leading to a totally flawed audit methodology. Approvals had devolved into mere administrative rubber stamps instead of active engineering gateways. Plus, there was glaring collusion and moral hazard going on, entirely enabled by an absence of segregation of duties. The exact same person overseeing the site progress was the sole signatory verifying the measurements for billing. Without an independent QA cross-check, the contractor and the site supervision team basically had a free pass to siphon off material costs together. And here is the real kicker. This entire fraud relied on one specific vulnerability inherent to construction: the ticking clock. You see, concrete is a fraudster's best friend. Once it gets poured over that reinforced slab, the evidence, the widened steel spacing, the rusted scrap, the wrong brands, is permanently buried. The perpetrators knew for a fact they had a massive concealment advantage. They were just banking on the concrete, hiding their tracks before anyone actually bothered to do a live physical inspection. All right, final section. Process engineering the solution. Let's look at the risk manager's recommendations. So the crucial point is this. How do we actually stop this? How do we engineer this vulnerability entirely out of existence? Well, the first major solution is implementing a mandatory digital pour cards workflow. This completely strips away that concealment advantage. Step 1, the site engineer ties the TMT grid, but now a measuring tape must be visibly laid across the grid in the frame. Step 2, they capture a time-stamped, geotagged photograph of that exact setup. Step 3, this evidence gets uploaded to a centralized application. And Step 4, only after that digital proof is verified can the concrete batching plant be authorized to dispatch. The concrete literally cannot flow until the physical reality is digitally proven. But obviously, we can't just stop at the pour card. There are non-negotiable controls that have to happen way earlier in the process. We've got to implement strict gate inwarding protocols. So, deploying maker-checker rules right at the gate. Security has to match the brand embossing on the physical steel directly against the digital purchase order. Also, if rusted or pitted steel arrives, it gets rejected immediately with a documented nonconformance report. We absolutely have to introduce mandatory secondary sign-offs by an independent project management consultant for all concealed works. And lastly, we need to completely re-engineer our audit protocols. We have to ban desk audits that solely rely on checking joint measurement sheets and receipt notes. Physical walkthroughs and live testing just have to be mandatory. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really vital question for the next time you review a perfectly tallied, pristine compliance file. I want you to look closely at your own processes and ask, are you actually auditing physical reality, or are you just rubber stamping a paper trail illusion? Because as we've clearly seen today, a signature on a page is never going to hold up a building. Keep digging, keep verifying, and whatever you do, never let the paperwork blind you to the truth on the ground.